Hi, everybody. I'm Tara Haelle. Welcome to today's webinar. You'll actually see me in a moment here. Today's webinar is Vaccine Injury Compensation in the U.S., Current Practices and Future Prospects. I am the Health Beat Leader on Infectious Disease for the Association of Healthcare Journalists. AHCJ is excited to partner yet again with the Expert Vaccine Analysis Team, a team of internationally recognized and trusted vaccine experts whose scientists and physicians have a long track record. We're talking like hundreds of cumulative years of leadership in vaccines, infectious disease, and public health. The Association of Healthcare Journalists, for those of you who are not familiar, is the largest organization of health journalists in the U.S., and we've partnered with EVAT to bring journalists an essential briefing on the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program to help journalists understand the program and how it might affect public health in the U.S. We often have many people who are not journalists here to learn what we have to say. Joining us today, we have Jesse Goodman. Let's see here if I can. There we go. Jesse Goodman, a professor of medicine and infectious diseases and attending physician at Georgetown University. He leads the EVAT team. Walter Orenstein, professor emeritus of medicine, pediatrics, epidemiology, and global health at Emory University. Michael Milmo, an attorney and partner at the law offices of Leah V. Durant and Associates, which handles vaccine injury cases, and a former DOJ lawyer who worked on VICP cases. And Anna Kirkland, a professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Michigan and author of Vaccine Court, The Law and Politics of Injury. A reminder that all the participants will be muted during this webinar. While the speakers are presenting, you are welcome to ask questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A space where the question mark is at the bottom of the Zoom frame. After each of the speakers has given their presentation, I'll direct the questions to our guests. And a reminder that the webinar will be recorded and publicly available later on today or tomorrow. Okay, we will start with Walt with an overview of what led to the creation of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program and what its purpose is. Please take it away, Walt.
Thank you for the opportunity to be talking to you about how and what got the incentives for developing the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. If I could have the next slide, please. What really got the modern anti-vaccine movement going was a television program in 1982 called DPT Vaccine Roulette. And this was a really gripping program that aired on the NBC affiliate in Washington, D.C., and then portions of it also aired on the Today Show and various NBC issues around the country. And it dealt with allegations that the wholesale pertussis vaccine and the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccines was causing severe brain damage, and that the risks of the vaccine far outweighed the benefits. And it showed children seizing on camera. It showed people with quadriplegia. It was just a very difficult thing to see. And certainly, if I didn't know better in the science, I would have believed it in a minute. And this led to the formation of a group called Dissatisfied Parents Together, DPT, which has since become named the National Vaccine Information Center. And this program then led to a barrage of lawsuits and vaccine shortages and real problems. If I could have the next slide, please. And so, in essence, this showed, it just brought out this feeling that vaccines were awful and that we should basically forget about vaccine issues. And so, if I can get the next slide, please. And so this is something that really played a major role And some of the issues that were brought up in DPT vaccine roulette are, were these cases actually caused by vaccine? And there was no science that was brought up. They had two groups of physicians. They had one who supported a role for vaccine in causation and said that the vaccines were far more dangerous than the disease, and two who said the vaccines were far better than the disease. And so this was a big problem with regard to the issues. Another issue that was brought up is that was on the science, but the data were not shown. It was just the anecdotes and the support by the physicians. And again, these were very touching stories. Then the next issue was the concerns about lack of knowledge about physicians regarding the importance of vaccination and how to explain that, the failure to inform prospective vaccinees about the risks and benefits of vaccination, and the lack of reporting of adverse events, the lack of recording in records the vaccines, the lot number, the manufacturer, to help in understanding the science of it. And what happened is it led to major problems with regard to our continuing our vaccination program, disincentives for manufacturers to come into the market or stay in the market, and difficulties for pediatricians in terms of how to deal with patient anxiety. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is a slide showing lawsuits filed against manufacturers by year. In 1981, there were only 3 lawsuits filed and asking for $25 million in damages. In 1982, that went up to 17 lawsuits for $414 million. And then, as you could see, after DPT vaccine roulette and the publications and Dissatisfied Parents Together efforts, we went up to 1985 over 200 lawsuits at a cost of $302 billion. And in 1986, I don't have the funding part of it, but 255 lawsuits. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what happened is companies didn't see the benefits outweighing the risk of staying in the market. And so in 1980, before all this began, 18 companies produced vaccines. Within a few years, just 4 remained. So what were the goals of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program? Next slide, please. One was to provide compensation for persons who were truly injured by vaccines. Persons who had been vaccinated basically not only are doing it to protect themselves, but to protect the community. The vast majority of vaccine preventable diseases are person-to-person spread diseases. You have an infectious person coming in contact with a susceptible person and transmitting the pathogen, the virus, the bacteria, to that susceptible person. If that infectious person only came in contact with immune people, the chain of transmission would be broken. And hence, indirectly, it would protect other people, such as people with legitimate medical contraindications who could not be vaccinated, people who had compromised immune systems and could not make a protective immune response, and people who are, even though they're normal, don't make a protective immune response. For example, with the recommended 2 doses of measles virus containing vaccines, about 97% of children are protected. How are the 3% protected? They're protected if they're not exposed. And thus, what was really important is to compensate people who were truly injured, because again, it was not only for their own benefit they were getting vaccinated, but for society's benefit as well. And the goal was, again, to support manufacturers to stay in the market, to incentivize development of new vaccines, and to continue the effort. Next slide, please. What you can see here is two documents that were sent to me by staffers who worked for Henry Waxman at the time, who was the representative in the House of Representatives that helped create and pass the legislation in 1986. And one of these documents is actually about the law itself. And the second one is the background of the immunization program and what led to the law. And so, to me, the vaccine injury compensation program has been very, very helpful in compensating people who are truly injured, who have to make the process much easier to get compensated than having to go through the tort system, and also to have, in a sense, automatic funding through an excise tax without the need for annual appropriations. Thank you. You're on mute, Tara.
I probably should leave the mute off. That's the second time I've done that. Thank you very much, Walt. You'll need to stop sharing your screen there. There you go. Sorry about that rough start, folks. Thank you very much for going through all that, Walt. You're going to hear more about the program here shortly from Mike as well. But first, we're going to go to Jesse, and we're going to hear. We just heard how that program and the lawsuits affected industry back in the day in 1986, which led, or in the 80s, which led to the thing. Jesse's going to talk about the concerns we have about how industry is thinking about these issues now. Go ahead, Jesse.
Thank you. And I think Marcel is going to put my slides up. Okay, so we heard a little from Walt about how, blows to confidence in immunization led to a lot of legal action and concerns, and how VICP worked to try to address the legitimate concerns and claims while providing protection more broadly for people to want to stay in the market. And so the point I wanted to make, as someone who, some of my early experiences in government were dealing with vaccine shortages, including the failure of Chiron, one of the manufacturers of flu vaccine in 2004, and how that affected us. And I saw firsthand how lack of investment, lack of return could really affect public health, and why this is important. And in the context of today, this becomes particularly important. We don't want to go back to a situation like we had 40 years ago, for example, where the majority of childhood vaccines were in shortage status, and children were having to have long delays in vaccination, and we were seeing diseases because of that. But to not go back to that, we need to understand the broader vaccine ecosystem, which is actually complex and fragile. Now, I'm not going to make anyone go through this. It's a whole other talk. But as you move from the left in research and development toward the right in immunization, there are multiple steps that must take place, and including involving people like FDA, CDC, ACIP, and the research that academia, industry, and government do. Next slide. So why would somebody make this commitment to develop a vaccine? Well, first of all, there's an unmet public health need. But any of these investment decisions on medical products are multifactorial and complex. And overall, the development of new vaccines and the manufacturing to produce them costs hundreds of millions to billions of dollars for a single vaccine. So that's a big investment to make. For earlier stage investment, like small companies with new ideas, which is where many of these vaccines came from that are protecting people now, venture capital or VC also has to choose between what little companies with good ideas do we invest in. And they're competing across different companies and then within the portfolio of the larger companies with a lot of other things. And this includes much more expensive drugs that are used for forever use or long-term use, like for immunologic, heart disease, and cancer. So just one little example that's been used a lot is you can be protected for life from hepatitis B for $81. That's the cost to the healthcare system. However, treatment, which isn't very good yet, is about $11,000 a year. So here you can see the massive difference in returns and also, frankly, in effectiveness and benefit to the health system. And when you look at what happens generally in 2025, estimated total US pharma sales are about 670 billion, of which about 200 billion is oncology, but vaccines were 28 billion, which to me comes out to about 4%. So this is a very small part of the industry, and it has to compete with all these other things of more expensive chronically used drugs. And just for some perspective, dietary supplements are 70 to 100 billion dollars a year, or again, 3 to 4 times that of vaccines. So when people look to invest, they have to see that there's going to be a return, that it's reasonable and favorable compared to other investments, and they have to look at the risks. And the risks include scientific and regulatory uncertainty, the actual benefit and market size. Product liability is not the whole thing, but it is a piece, and it's one that's been rendered more predictable by the compensation program. And just to point out, even if a vaccine is successfully developed and licensed, it's significantly expensive to keep up manufacturing, testing, and all the associated costs. Next slide. So some recent events raise red flags. Threats of expanded litigation that were previously associated with loss of manufacturers, a lack of investment in childhood vaccine shortages. That's what we saw before. We also have seen in the past commoditized prices, which were associated with the failure to fund needed innovation and infrastructure. So flu vaccine shots used to be just a few dollars, barely could recover the costs. And this led to industry not investing in flu vaccine or their manufacturing industry, the manufacturing capacity, and the failure, as I mentioned, of a major flu manufacturer in 2003, wiping out half the supply of flu vaccine in the United States. And these issues have been partially mitigated in recent decades, in part by the VICP, allowing patient compensation for scientifically accepted possible vaccine-related injuries. The person, you'll hear from our experts, the person doesn't have to prove that their particular injury was caused by it, but just that it's consistent. And this has resulted in reduced risk to manufacturers. And in the market, more predictable regulatory paths, sound ACIP recommendations, and improved pricing and healthcare use for cost-effective, impactful new vaccines, like for pneumonia, shingles, and for human papillomavirus and cervical cancer. Next slide. However, we're seeing threats to this balance of incentives and disincentives. There is an increasing lack of predictability of and threats to demand. For example, changes to the ACIP process, HHS circumventing ACIP, and the secretary just declaring that the vaccine schedule has changed without scientific foundation, suddenly removing 6 vaccines, 6 to 7, from the routine recommendations. And then there's been a ton of rhetoric undermining public confidence and uptake from the highest levels at many times. There's been changes in predictability of FDA, and changes in recommendation. For example, the non-approval of COVID vaccines for young adults, the refusal to file in the last couple of days an application for a new flu vaccine. There have been cuts to basic and applied research and development, and unpredictability of public-private partnerships that have driven American innovation. And this includes from people, points of investment like NIH and BARDA at HHS. and a number of actions that enhance uncertainty and risk for liability. Maybe we'll hear more about it from my colleagues. Changes to the committee that oversees this, changes on the seat, for example, the CDC changing its website to remove the statement that there's no evidence of vaccines causing autism. Anti-vaccine activists seeking control of actual data and databases. These are concerning. And they raise the possible risk of non-science-based major or multiple lawsuits, of claims that are not scientifically supported, like autism or another common diseases caused by vaccines. And just for this, I did a little back of the envelope calculation. If an estimated 5 million or so Americans do have autism, even just awarding them $100,000 each could reach $540 billion, or a total of more than 20 years of all vaccine sales and 100 times the current trust fund. So I think things can always be improved, but we have to be conscious that we're playing with fire, that we've been in this place before, and when we saw shortages and problems with access and resulted in problems with infections. And these risks may already be affecting investment in innovation. We've heard many comments from investors in VC, and even very recently, Moderna stating that it's going to abandon the expensive late-stage infectious disease studies. And then the final slide. So what we see is brush fires in multiple parts of this complex ecosystem, and we don't want this to all ignite and result in us not having, and our children not having access to vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Excuse me. Now we'll move on to Mike. And I'm just going to mention that I interviewed Mike a couple of years ago when I wrote about the vaccine injury compensation program and differences between it and the countermeasure program that was used with COVID. And I will say he is a remarkable resource for journalists because he's been on both sides of this. I don't know if there's anyone who has been on both sides of this. So go ahead, Mike.
Also having a problem with mute. Thank you. It's really nice to be here and to be part of such a distinguished panel. Just a word about my background that Tara just meant. Yeah, I spent 28 years at the Department of Justice defending vaccine cases. I retired in 2017, spent almost the next 9 years as in private practice, actually bringing vaccine cases. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been there from the beginning. I will just make a few remarks about kind of where we've been, where we're at, and where we're headed. Where we've been, I think Walt did a fantastic job of telling us what was intended in the goals of the vaccine injury compensation program. I can't stress enough how revolutionary this was at the time. This was groundbreaking stuff. This is the first time Congress ever tried to enter the world of tort reform. And I think Congress and Congressman Waxman and his sponsor in the Senate, Senator Kennedy, did a fantastic job of putting together a program with fantastic goals. They set up a program whereby there's a fund created, and you will bring a petition trying to seek compensation from that fund. You're no longer suing the doctor or the administrator of your vaccine that caused your problem. That's the first question I get now for the last almost 9 years from potential clients is, gosh, do I have to sue my doctor? The answer is no. People have been with their doctor for 25 years. They don't want to sue their doctor. And here you don't have to. And Congress made sure that that was not something that you had to do. They set up a program where you petition for funds from the vaccine fund. The fund was created by excise taxes that are given for every dose of vaccine that's given. It's currently 75 cents. And that is how the vaccine fund has grown now to over $4.5 billion. The payments that are made on these cases are usually paid each year just from the interest that is made from that excise tax that is put into the fund. it also, the Vaccine Act was really groundbreaking because you never had to prove causation in many cases. The act provides for a vaccine injury table, which is kind of a document, a policy document, which says that if you experience certain symptoms within a certain time frame, you are entitled to a presumption of causation. The court often talks about what is the standard that they use to decide vaccine cases. It's a preponderance standard. What's more likely than not? What the court sometimes refers to as 50% and a feather. And if you gain that in your petition to get a presumption of causation, it relieves you from having to do the traditional things that you do in civil court. There's no product design. There's no products liability issues. You are entitled to a presumption. The government can rebut that presumption, but it's very difficult to do that because we're dealing with really, really rare injuries. There are injuries that that the increase in incidence is increased by maybe 1 in a million doses. So we're talking about the rarest of possible injuries, and when you gain that presumption, it's invaluable. The government is almost never able to rebut that. They can in some rare cases, but it gives you a complete advantage in being able to gain vaccine compensation. The other revolutionary thing, there's no discovery in these cases. In most civil cases can go on for years, depositions, going through company emails, all kinds of depositions that go on for years. Here, there's no discovery by right, and discovery is really discouraged by the special masters in the court. The other thing that the Congress did is they made a real emphasis on speed and generosity in these cases. They wanted people to be compensated who were either clearly injured by vaccines or might have been injured by vaccines. It was intended to be an inclusive thing. Those rewards were supposed to be made generous. And the proceedings to have cases tried in the vaccine program were supposed to be less adversarial than they were in civil court. And then the last and final thing it did is it provided legal help for you. You were entitled to get an attorney of your choice, somebody who you were comfortable with. There are a number of law firms that deal specifically with vaccine injuries, including my own. And that is all paid for by the program. The program, that fund that we talked about earlier, is funds all of the awards, but it also funds the attorney's fees. You might have seen the 60 Minutes piece that was on a few weeks ago. The point came up, hey, the lawyers aren't getting rich on this program because it is, everything is done on an hourly basis and reviewed very carefully by the court. You have to apply for your attorney's fees at the end of the case, and the court can cut them or approve them or do whatever they want. It's based on the reasonableness of what you supply to the court and that the special master reviews. So with that in mind, I'll move on to how are we doing? That was the goal. Those were the goals that were set in 1986 by the Act. And here we are almost 40 years later. I think some of the goals that Congress set out, are probably need to be modernized. There were a lot more cases filed than anybody ever anticipated. There are special masters that were appointed in the beginning of this program who left their jobs early on saying, there's not going to be enough cases. Well, it turns out that the number of cases filed each year is more and more and more, to the point where there is a backlog. So the goals that I talked about being less adversarial, I'm afraid as time has gone on, the proceedings have become more adversarial. Maybe not as adversarial as they are in traditional civil court, but still very adversarial. And the speed has slowed way down. Congress intended these cases to be disposed of within 240 days. That's part of the Vaccine Act. There was an additional 120 days that you could get for suspension time, but under no circumstances was any case supposed to last over 420 days. There are cases in this program that go on for 10 years. And that is terribly unfortunate. That is why the program is somewhat broken. I think the most recent statistics I saw from the Department of Justice at the Vaccine Commission from December said, they thought the average case was about 3 years. But don't forget, that includes cases that are put into the special processing unit, which are processed quicker because they're not as complicated, and the court expects those cases to either be settled or resolved quickly by the court. So the other cases are moving at sort of a very glacial pace. That's not the fault of the special masters. By statute, there's only 8 of them. And so they're working very hard. I know all of them. I've known them all since the time that the program began. I started practicing in this area in 1988. And they work very hard, as do the people at the Department of Justice, as do the people at HHS. They're people who are trying to make it work as best they can, but there are inherent challenges that are slowing things down. And then I think where are we headed? We can talk during the Q&A about some of the changes that would help this program work a little bit better. There are ones that have been through, that are working their way through the House, things that everybody seems to agree on. Raising the caps, the maximum award that you can receive for pain and suffering that was set in 1986 was $250,000. Well, inflation would now make that award be, over $600,000. And so people who received an award for their case in 1986, $250,000 might have been a lot of money then. But it's not as big, it's not worth as much as it is today. And that's one of the things that needs to be changed. I think the statute of limitations needs to be increased. They need to have more special masters. And that has to be easier for vaccines to be added to the table. One of the great things that Congress did when they passed the thing in 1986, they said every time a new vaccine comes out that is approved for use by children, routine use by children, it can be added to the vaccine injury table by the secretary after the CDC recommends its addition to the table. That process needs to move a little more quickly. And so I think there's work to do. There is modernization to the program that needs to be undertaken. I'm sorry that one of the leaders in the House that's been responsible for moving things along is apparently not running for re-election. I'm hoping that something will happen and happen quickly, and I'm hoping that the secretary is able to make some changes to the table that we can talk about that I think would make the program work better. Thank you.
Thank you for all of that, Mike. And just I'll mention real quick, when you were talking about adding things, a lot of people don't realize that the COVID vaccines still have not been added, even though they should have been. And it takes an act of Congress. Usually that happens with just a quick rider. And that is one among the problems that I think you were referring to when you're saying it needs to be easier to add them. All right, Anna, take it away.
All right, great. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to bring us up to the present, sort of why is everyone thinking about this right now? And as you heard, there are a lot of problems, and we also have a health secretary who's fairly hostile in a lot of ways to this program. So Congress could at any time make any changes that it wants to this program. And that's one little mystery here, is that there have been many bills. What Mike just told you, many people have for many years wanted to make all these changes, and it's never happened politically. And part of that, I think, is that there's always an undercurrent of controversy, or there has been for many years, particularly around autism. So I just want to talk about some details here about what changes might actually happen, how those changes happen. And I guess I'm the social scientist and the academic here, so I want to drag us into some of the details because I think they are really, really important. And we've got a complicated process that's very likely, I believe, to bog down in the details. And so I know journalists like to write very dramatic headlines, but I think some of the process and the details and the political fighting that's going to happen is going to be really, really important. And it's going to slow things down and change things in unexpected ways. So here's what I think you need to know. We've talked about, you've probably heard that Secretary Kennedy could change the injury table that Mike just talked about, say by adding autism to the table. And the way this has been presented is that if that happens, there'll be these enormous costs because if those claims go through, there's so many people and the claims would be so large that it would bankrupt the fund and thereby destroy the program. And I guess the implicit in that is the argument that Congress isn't going to just pass a bill to destroy the program, to dismantle the program, because they could. But I don't think anyone thinks that that's going to happen. Everybody's looking, I think, more at this regulatory dismantling option. So the secretary can put forth regulations to change the table. It would have to go through the Advisory Commission on Childhood Vaccines, ACCV, which we've recently noticed the composition has changed. They've removed a few people. Now the website doesn't say that they've been removed yet, and we don't know who will be put on that committee. So we'll see. But whatever happens, the rule has to be presented to that committee. They have 90 days to consider it, and then it needs to go through the standard administrative rulemaking process with a 180-day comment period. And that is all written in the statute that has to happen. So there will be a very big lead up. This is probably important for journalists. You will know what these changes are, and they will be around for mobilization and contestation politically and through this process for a while. So that's what I'm waiting on. That's kind of what we're all waiting on to start happening. The way that has been discussed as maybe happening is by expanding the definition of encephalopathy in a way that would include autism. So we've heard folks say, well, we don't want to put autism, let's try to find some kind of backdoor. The argument that I've made about that is that it just will move the fighting to whether that has been satisfied as a table condition. So we have the vaccine injury table, and then 10 pages of that at the end are what's called qualifications and aids to interpretation, which are all the definitions and where the fighting is. And so the special masters will still have to decide for every case, let's look at all the medical records and will this qualify as a table injury, right? And so there's no getting around the disputes that are going to happen there. They're just going to be moved to that level of the process. And so let's take it to the court. Then that's the administrative process to change the table. Then there's what could happen at the court. When I did all my interviewing and observation for my book, I kept hearing, and I'm sure Mike can talk more about this, that folks who are trying to bring cases have a lot of trouble building the medical records, putting the medical records together to show what they need to show. And sometimes they can't pull that together in a medical record. So again, there's going to be these fact-based disputes over whether this person really qualifies for a table injury or not. And just establishing the facts of that are pretty complex and difficult. And none of this goes away if they are able to make these table changes. We'd still be in that world of things taking a really long time. Like it would take a lot longer to fight all this out. And the last thing I want to say to conclude is that, if the special masters don't want to go along with this, and I am pretty sure they will not, what is the option to remove them? And I've said in my piece that I published in the conversation that they can't just be removed. They're appointed by the judges of the Court of Federal Claims. So there's a way to appoint them. They can't just be removed by the secretary. What I'm watching, though, is the Supreme Court case this term in Trump v. Slaughter, which is another one of these executive power cases where Justice Kagan raised in the oral argument that what does this mean for the Article I courts, which is the Court of Federal Claims? And she named the Court of Federal Claims as a possible court that could come under executive power, allowing Trump just to fire anyone on it that he wants. And, the person defending at the Supreme Court said, oh, no, we are not going there. But it's pretty obvious that when the court decides Trump v. Slaughter in favor of executive power, we could be then in a situation, come June, where Trump could remove the special masters and just put in people who will write whatever. Now, how they would actually write that and create these decisions, it would be hard to see again, because this is just a highly detailed, highly scientific, relying on lots of justification. It's not the world where you can just make things up. So I just want to put in a plea to journalists to get a little bit into the details on this rather than assuming, everything is just going to blow up in a predictably awful way.
All right. Thank you, Anna. Yes, devil is always in the details, as good journalists know. And I do see one question here from Mary Beth Miato. Excuse me, no, from Michelle Shishkin about whether there have been any cases from the COVID-19 vaccine. And that's one I can answer because I've done a lot of writing on this, and if you email me, I can send you some articles that I've written on this. Because the COVID-19 vaccine is not part of VICP currently. It is currently reimbursed under the countermeasure injury compensation program that was set up around, I think it was after 9/11 under the Bush administration. And that program has many, many, many more limitations that the VICP does not. It is not nearly as friendly to complainants. And one of the big issues that needs to happen is that the COVID-19 vaccines need to be added. This was kind of a soapbox of mine when I was writing about this. So I'm happy to share that article if anyone wants that. I'm also going to skip over to Bruce Gellen's question because it was also my question for Anna. I had written to myself, Kennedy can't bypass the ACCV as he did with ACIP. That was my question. And Bruce asked a very similar question. If the secretary can make changes to the recommended vaccine schedule and sideline ACIP, why would he follow the rules with ACCV? I don't know how different the statutes are there. So the question is, will he bother following the rules when he clearly did not with ACIP?
Well, the first answer is the statute says you have to do that.
Okay.
So it's pretty clear in that sense, he has to do it. If he doesn't do it, what are the consequences? It's lawsuits.
Okay.
And, and in the past, we've seen the last regulatory change to change the table failed. And part of the reason there were political reasons and the support for it shifted, but also there was some sense that maybe the deadlines hadn't been followed exactly and that maybe it was scientifically questionable, and that tanked the last attempt to change the table. So it's one of those answers that yes, they have to follow the rules, and if they don't, there will be lawsuits, and those lawsuits should be successful because it'd be pretty clear that the law had been violated.
Okay, thank you for that. And we already see that the AAP is suing for the ACIP changes, so I'm sure that those lawsuits would be filed pretty quickly. A good question from Mary Beth Miato. This is probably a question for either Walter or for Jesse. Do we have any evidence that autism counts as encephalopathy, since that's obviously not what autism specialists would call it?
I'm not aware. I don't know if Jesse is, but I'm not aware of anything that says that. I think one of the issues also is to have a independent body with scientific credentials look at how the table should or should not be revised. The Institute of Medicine played a big role in determining what was causally related and what was not. Now it's called the National Academy of Medicine. And one thing that's difficult on causation is, for example, if vaccines didn't cause or prevent autism and 90% of children were vaccinated, we would expect purely by chance that 90% of autism cases would occur in vaccinated children, coincidentally. If 99% were in children with vaccinated children, autism cases was 99% of them were vaccinated, that would support a role for vaccine in causation. And if like 70% of them were vaccinated, it would support a role for vaccines in prevention. But the need to have the science to try and determine what is causally related and what is not. Because it's, I think, very naturally, if event B follows event A, to blame event A for causing event B. And having enough resources and having an independent, respected body like the National Academy of Medicine, I think would be very important for evaluating what changes to the table should be made.
Thank you for that. I accidentally posted a link in response to Christine's question. I'm going to move to her question. It's what I posted there is not relevant to your question, Christine. Could you elaborate on what you're hearing from investors about how the policy uncertainty is already affecting investment and innovation in vaccines? And is it possible that could vaccine markets in other countries make up for the disruptions in the U.S., at least when it comes to R&D? And I'm guessing that's probably a Jesse question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to try that. We have seen some pretty forceful statements, including from the CEO of Moderna. Now, they have some specific issues, and in some ways, the RNA vaccines have been signaled out. But he's really pointing, I mean, as I mentioned in my talk, they have basically said, we're not going to do any late stage development for infectious diseases. So here you have the vaccine technology that saved millions of lives around the world in COVID. And they're basically saying we're going to have to abandon that for infectious diseases because of these barriers. And, it's not just liability. In fact, in this case, it's the unpredictability of the market and the unpredictability of FDA not meeting its prior commitments that's driving that. And the Wall Street Journal, I haven't seen it yet, but apparently has an editorial today about one of these most recent decisions, again, and raising a lot of concern about how this will disincentivize innovation and industry. There is no question. Industry has already had, I know this from working with people, they have a hard time justifying compared to oncology to begin with, even in a robust functional market like we've had the last several years where people can get excellent returns on vaccine. Even in that circumstance, they're competing with psoriasis, serious chronic diseases that require long-term treatment. So I think that also industry is very reluctant to talk about this because they're also engaged in negotiations about pricing and all these things. So I think we are already seeing a chilling effect and the tip of the iceberg here.
All right, thank you for that. A good question from Heather here. Can you speak to any efforts being undertaken at the jurisdiction level to insulate changes to VICP? That's either an Anna or a Mike question. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any changes for jurisdiction. The jurisdiction was decided 40 years ago to be in the Court of Federal Claims. That's where the cases are heard, provides for a special master to hear your case and to develop the case in front of him or her and to make a final decision in it. I'm not aware of any challenges that either the secretary or outside sources are making to the jurisdiction of the Vaccine Act. Anna, have you heard anything?
Okay, that's good to know. This is probably also a question for Mike, might be Anna. Are you anticipating any vaccines on the table could be removed in the near future, given the changes to the childhood vaccination schedule? I know how vaccines are added. I don't know how they're removed, if that's even in the statute.
Yeah, vaccines can be removed. I think it has happened once in the course of history, and it was only removed because I think it was the RotoShield vaccine was at least effectively removed because the manufacturers weren't making it anymore, and they had moved on to the Rototech vaccines and things that were more protective for rotavirus in children. I think what that question is getting to is that since the act covers the table covers vaccines that are routinely recommended for children, now that the secretary has said not all of them are mandatory, we're making changes to the schedule. There are some vaccines which are optional. Could those vaccines no longer be covered by the Vaccine Act? I think that's very unlikely. But at least when the Roto Shield vaccine was no longer being produced, through the course of the statute of limitations of when Roto Shield vaccines could be the subject of a vaccine petition, the government didn't remove it until that period had ended. But I think that's to be determined in some ways. What are the effects that the secretary's making some vaccines, part of the schedule and part of them optional to discuss with your pediatrician. I don't think that's entirely clear quite yet.
Anna, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Mike's right. It's a little bit unclear, although another legal principle is that if you have to do the rulemaking process to put it on, you got to do a rulemaking process to take it off. And so that could be another thing that has to happen. Or if it's removed, that would be possibly arbitrary and capricious and a good lawsuit option. So.
Okay. And by the way, just in case for people who aren't aware, we've shared a few links in the chat here. I've shared links to 2 of the articles about the differences between the vaccine injury compensation program and the countermeasure injury compensation program. If you are wondering how the COVID-19 vaccines work, we also shared the Wall Street Journal editorial that Jesse referred to there, and I shared an article about on MedPage Today about the Rotashield story that Mike just alluded to, the first rotavirus vaccine. Excellent question from Rachel Riley. Do you think that changes to the program, and I know I'm going to add to this, or threatened changes to the program could have any impact on vaccine hesitancy? I think both of those are good questions. And I'm not sure who to direct that one to. I don't know, Walt, you've done some looking at vaccine hesitancy. Do you think that there would be effects on vaccine hesitancy, which is already in flux quite a bit, if there were changes made to the program?
I could take a try at it, this Jesse. Yeah, I mean, I think we're in an environment of confusion where all of these allegations and changes just, affect complex health behaviors in a way that it's one more barrier or one more thing to question whether to do this. So I do think when issues get brought up that the court is not adequate, that, again, I think I agree with some of the very helpful comments that there's a lot of reform and additional resources needed, et cetera. But I think, for example, if there's a broad discussions again intimating that autism is caused by vaccines when the science doesn't show that, that undermines people's confidence, and they're just going to say, well, maybe I shouldn't get this vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're going to, I'm still really, really worried about what's going on with measles in this country. And there's going to be a lot of people who make personal choices that they think are good that are going to turn out to be bad and potentially hurt their children and communities. And that's what we all worry about. Everybody wants their children to stay healthy.
Yeah, that's my big concern, is that the more injuries, for example, that put on the table, the more it would contribute to hesitancy. And my concern is, what is the science behind that? And to understand what is coincidentally related versus causally related. And the fact that people often don't understand that. I just tried to show you one of the things we use to determine causation is something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is HMO records, Health Management Organization records, and you look at the incidence of a given clinical syndrome in vaccinees versus non-vaccinees. If it's the same, that would imply coincidence. If it's higher in vaccinees, it would imply causation. But if arbitrarily lots of illnesses are added to it, I think it will just contribute to hesitancy and the potential resurgence of vaccine preventable diseases. I would hate to see a polio outbreak come over to people to understand the benefits. One of the problems with prevention is it's a hard sell, because with a successful prevention program, nothing happens and people don't realize they're getting any benefits as opposed to therapy. But my concern is in the absence of polio outbreaks, in the absence of big meningitis outbreaks, people are not going to understand the benefits. And by adding these things without good science into that, it really, I think, will just reinforce hesitancy and a return to circulation of many of these vaccine preventable pathogens.
We are right at almost the top of the hour. We're going to go over a little bit longer, just briefly. Excellent question from Bruce, which I'll bet you Bruce knows part of the answer to this, but it's a really good question. Is this a US issue only? Like, how is liability handled outside of the US with vaccine injury? And what are the related implications for the vaccine supply in other markets? I'm guessing that's probably an Anna question there.
Yeah, there are, I'm the number 29 is sticking in my head, something in the upper 20s of other countries that have this. And they do it in a lot of different ways, most often within the national health insurance programs of those countries. So the way that we do it in this sort of legal liability and then this special court is very unusual. It's the American solution. I write about this in the book, why we do it the way we do it as opposed to the way that other countries do it. But, in the context of a national healthcare system, they have insurance boards handle it or other, scientific boards, other more administrative, less adversarial, and more bound into the administration of their healthcare systems generally. Because, remember one thing about ours is there's no safety net for a lot of people with a long-term child with a long-term injury. We just have a much more kind of um, more vicious harms come to people because of the way our healthcare system and disability support systems work. And other countries are just organized very differently legally and in their healthcare systems.
Thank you for that. I think we've answered all of the questions here. I'm going to ask one final question from each of you. What would you like to see journalists writing about right now? What do you think they should be preparing for? Like what is most important for journalists to have kind of on their radar for what to cover? And when you answer that, please think both in terms of the national, but I'm also curious locally because a lot of the journalists who might look at this will be local journalists. So I don't know who wants to start there. Sorry, I sprang that question on you guys without warning there. Jesse, I'm gonna pick on you first.
Yeah, well, I'm really concerned that when you see these brush fires at multiple points and with the attacking the vaccine injury compensation program is very different than reforming it, improving it, strengthening it, making sure it benefits the people it's intended to benefit. So I'm all for that, but I'm worried that what's going on here is an attempt to remove liability protection to create a wild west, whether it's by getting injuries into the table that are not scientifically proven to be related to vaccines, or simply moving a lot of the action out of this essentially no fault system that, for all its inefficiencies, is more efficient than a regular tort system. So I'm really worried that there's an in the midst of good reform, there's an attack on the entire system of immunization that's going on. And that, as I said, that could be, I had another picture that I forgot to show, but I'm worried this could be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
You're on mute, Tara.
Boy, we are having all kinds of issues with mute here. I'm so sorry. Anna, do you have anything you want to share that you'd like journalists to check out?
I mean, I already alluded to watching what happens in this rulemaking process, and then there's going to be 6 months of a comment period, and that is the mobilization period, and that is, putting in those comments. And, I'm telling everyone who's interested in this, when that comment period opens, whatever the proposed regulation says, everybody needs to make a comment on it that is informed, and there are a lot of resources to go to about how to do a good comment. But journalists could educate people about what that process is. I also think reminding everyone that Congress could act in this, that's pretty hopeless now. We have what I think is the situation of constitutional collapse with Congress and its relationship to the president. But just educating the public about what the governance structure of this should be, and then previewing that's the relevance of the Supreme Court case and the expansion of executive powers and how that might impinge on things. But also, I I will say this, I have not liked a lot of the tone of coverage that I've seen where it makes the secretary seem very powerful and like he can just make all these things happen and that everything will automatically collapse. And what I've really been trying to emphasize is that there's a lot of stoppage points, there's a lot of bureaucratic grind. None of this is inevitable, and there's nobody who's all powerful in this. It's kind of the beauty of this system. It's very multifaceted. And so I just would ask to maybe avoid that kind of tone that I have seen in a lot of coverage.
Thank you for that. I think part of the reason you might be seeing that tone is because he has tried to do that, but what people don't realize is that he is getting stopped doing that. So one person asked, a lot of what Kennedy has done is eluded the comment period. Do we expect him to follow the process? He might try not to follow the process, but it's going to immediately be stopped in the
There
court.
are a lot of costs to
Yeah.
doing that, and we
Yeah.
can impose those costs.
Yeah, and that is happening. I think a lot of people underestimate how much the courts are doing right now. The courts have been stopping a lot of things that people don't realize they've been stopping. So, Mike, do you have any final thoughts for journalists?
Yeah, I think just to kind of piggyback onto Anna's points, watch what comes out of the secretary's office because, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal, I mean, this is the first secretary ever at HHS who has got familiarity with the Vaccine Act. I worked at DOJ for 28 years when new politicians were appointed based on elections. Part of what our office would do would be to try to educate those folks as to what the Vaccine Act is. And I can't tell you how many of those politicians, those appointees, would be like, what is the Vaccine Act? You mean I'm responsible for that? Gosh, what do I do? What is it? So, I think there are reasons to be hopeful because I believe that the secretary's got to understand that to dismantle this act would have a really bad effect on people who've been injured by vaccines and undo everything that's gone on for the last 40 years. I mean, he has the power to make it better. And from what I understand, he's being advised that there are changes that could be made that would be helpful to the program. And so if journalists can kind of listen to what's coming out of the secretary's office, I think that would be helpful. I guess the other point I would make is, there are two ways that the secretary can change the act fundamentally. One is through legislation. He can't do that himself, but he could direct HHS to make through their Office of Legislative Affairs to make recommendations. And secondly is the one that Anna's been talking about, making actual changes to the table. And I've been looking for him to do one thing or the other since he's been appointed because he is active in the area of vaccines. And I haven't heard anything from the secretary's office. I mean, he's been dealing with, changing the food pyramids and getting rid of coloring in foods and whatnot. But I know vaccines is something that is, he cares very much about. I just think the journalists need to press him as to what can he do, what can HHS do, what can DOJ do to make the program better, because it is, as I said in my remarks, in need of modernization and in need of changes. I'm hopeful that he will get to this. It hasn't been one of his major priorities, I don't think, to make changes to the act based on his actions of dealing with all these other things first. But if I had a chance to be a journalist and to have an opportunity to talk to the secretary, I'd say, what changes do you want to make for the betterment of the act to make it work better for citizens, because it is absolutely vital to our national health policy, and we don't want to lose it, and we want to make it work.
Thanks for that. I'm not going to put this question out there because we're running out of time here, but one person did ask whether there were insurance companies or health system think tanks estimating costs of the loss of vaccine products. And I would encourage journalists to check Health Affairs Journal, because there probably will be something in there if there has not already. And I know that there are some cost effectiveness folks out there looking at some stuff like that. Walt, did you have any final comments
Yeah,
here?
I think a couple things. One, I think it would be helpful to explain to the public how we determine whether an illness following vaccination is causally related or coincidentally related. I think there's a lack of understanding of that and the system we have in place for determining it. I think another issue would be, how do we get a group that is not politically oriented, like the current ACIP and other groups, to look at what is causally related and what is not, and the potential role that a group like the National Academy of Medicine can play in that kind of independent effort, and which is not influenced by opinions from various people in various groups. They look at the data, and they've been very helpful in terms of adjudicating what is causally related and what is not. But I think it would be very important to try to explain that we also have a system in place to get us safe and effective vaccines. And I use the HIV vaccine as an example. It's been over 40 years since the human immunodeficiency virus was identified as the cause of AIDS. The thinking at the time is we'd have a vaccine in a couple of years. We had promising candidates, but none of them met safety and effectiveness criteria to get approved. And I think to try and explain to the public what is the system in place to assure that vaccines we have are safe and effective, and how we make changes when we learn something, such as the discussion of removing rotoshield from our vaccines when it was determined that in about 1 in 10,000 vaccinees got a form of bowel blockage called intussusception.
Thank you for that. Thank you everybody for joining us. I've got up here the let's see if there we go. I included my email on the bottom of that in case anyone wanted to ask me specific questions. Thank you to all of you who tuned in today. If you joined us late, we'll send everyone the webinar recording will be posted later on today or tomorrow. Again, thank you to all the speakers for taking your time to share your expertise, and good luck on your stories and in your other work, since I know a lot of you are not journalists. Thank you very much.